Hi, and welcome to another session of a Digital Experience Webinar series. Today's webinar will be an introduction to web accessibility. My name is Matthäus, and I'm based in Hamburg, in Germany, and I'm working as a web solutions architect. So yeah, before we kick things off, I want to give you a quick overview of what's coming up next in our digital experience webinars. So as I mentioned before, today's webinar will be about introduction to web accessibility. And on the 25th of July, we will have a webinar on how to optimize web accessibility. And on the 27th July, we will be offering office hours. And so, yeah, you can ask any questions on both sessions. And yeah, feel free to attend any of these sessions, or also feel free to share it with your colleagues. And as a reminder, all videos are available on demand after each training. And also, I would like to invite you to fill out the feedback form, which will be on the right-hand side of your screen. And yeah, for today, what we will go through today is I will give you a quick intro on why accessibility matters, and then a small introduction to web and content accessibility guidelines, which is the short is WCAG. And we will finish off with the most common WCAG failures and how this can be prevented and also fixed. And there will be some slides included, which I will not show you today, but there will be, in the slide deck, which I will share later on. And so you can, go through it for further reading. So let's start with why accessibility really matters. And so we have to look at the basics first. What does accessibility or disability mean for you? So as we can see here, accessibility is defined as enabling people with disabilities to live independently and participate fully in all aspects of life. So accessibility is about identifying and eliminating obstacles and barriers to equal access for everyone. And disability, well, there's not a single way to define disability. It has a lot of different meanings across different communities. It can be broadly defined as a mismatch between a person's physical, sensory, also cognitive condition and their environment. And also disabilities can also be very situational, also temporary or permanent. But how does it relate to web accessibility? And to just give you a quick overview on common examples of web accessibility needs. So, for example, we have, for example, users with hearing impairments who are relying on captions for video content. Or we have, for example, also users with visual impairments, who have to use assistive technologies, for example, a screen reader, so that they, basically can have the web content read out to them. And although it's very challenging to address all use cases, basically by applying best practices and having an inclusive mindset when designing and developing a web page can help to improve web experience for all type of impairments. So this is something we have to keep in mind when developing websites. And also, disability can affect any of us at any time. It impacts everyone. So in the world, 1 in 8 self-identify as disabled, but at some point, almost everyone will experience some form of disability. So as I mentioned before, it has many different meanings. So besides permanent impairments, there are also temporary, situational, and for example, maybe let's, for example, think about, you had an arm injury and you can't use a mouse, so you have to rely on your keyboard so that you can navigate a web page just by using your keyboard. This is also, for example, an example for temporary needs. And also, it's not just the right thing to do, but also, for example, it contributes to the business growth. And people with disabilities are the world's largest minority group. So as we can see here in this slide, the scale is huge, like because it's not the people with impairments or disabilities, but also their family members and friends. And so, yeah, but just when we just talk about people with disabilities, globally, it's over 1 billion, so which is almost 15% of the world's population. And yeah, but it means like when a website is not accessible, yeah, the business is excluding a huge group of potential customers with a significant spending power. Like you can see the number here, which is $8 trillion. So yeah, it means that by not having an accessible web page, yeah, there's a lot of yeah, basically business growth and global buying power, which is being missed. So yeah, we saw on the previous slide there's that accessibility is yeah, a global opportunity to drive business. And on number one, for example, as it mentioned here, it says that 71% of online shoppers with accessibility needs will leave a web page if there's a usability issue. And also, yeah, companies without accessible sites are losing around $7 billion in annual revenue to competitors whose sites are accessible. And yeah, so we talked about the human imperative and also the business imperative, but also there's this legal imperative, which is stated here on point 3 and 4. So yeah, the governments worldwide are enforcing regulations on businesses who serve customers with disabilities or are open to public, so basically to everyone. And these regulations are most prominent in the US and EMEA. And yeah, for example, the European Accessibility Act will require that all businesses serve customers in the EU must have an accessible website by 2025. And also, like point 4, you can see that yeah, e-commerce website with accessibility issues account for 4 of 5 American with Disabilities Act related website lawsuits, which is a high number. So it's really important to yeah, start acting now and to like really be sure that yeah, a web page meets just accessibility requirements. And yeah, I would like to show you now, like, okay, like what kind of requirements we're talking about. So let's have a look at WCAG now. So as I mentioned before, WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And it defines a set of guidelines on how to make web content more accessible to people with disabilities. And it's being developed through the World Wide Web Consortium in a process in cooperation with individuals and organizations around the world. And there are 13 guidelines, and for each guideline, there are testable success criteria. You will also see them later on when I show you some examples yeah, and best practices. You will always see like the success criteria at the top on the slides, but I will mention it to you later on also. And the guidelines, on the other hand, are organized under 4 principles. So for 4 principles, we have perceivable, we have operable, we have understandable, and we have robust. So perceivable, for example, is that users must be able to perceive the information being presented. So it can't be invisible to all of the senses. Operable is a user must be able to operate the interface. UI components and navigation cannot require interaction that a user cannot perform. Understandable, users must be able to comprehend the information of the UI. The content or interaction cannot be beyond their understanding. Robust is, yeah, content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted by a wide variety of user agents. Also very important, yeah, including assistive technologies. And as I mentioned on the previous slides, for each guideline, there are testable success criteria. And the success criteria are at 3 levels. So we have level A, we have level AA, we have level AAA. which is shown in this slide. And so level AA is the target compliance level, but yeah, have to be covered when you want to have an accessible web page or compliant web page according to the EU Web Accessibility Directive. So this is kind of the target level we are always aiming for, level AA. And yeah, now let's deep dive into the most common WCAG failures, which will be our focus today. So yeah, as you can see on this slide, the most common types of WCAG failures are low contrast text, missing alternative text for images, empty links, missing form input labels, empty buttons, missing document language. I will go into more detail on the other slides, what this means in particular. And but yeah, you can see like as a key takeaway that almost 97% of all errors detected fall into these 6 categories. So, and it's also, this issue has been almost the same for last 3 years. As you can see on this slide, also the numbers from 2020 to until 2022, yeah, are very close in percentage. So it has not changed that much in the last 3 years, which is quite a pity. And yeah, addressing just these few types of issues would significantly improve accessibility across the web. So this is also why we want to focus on these 6 today, because these are one of the most common types of WCAG failures. But before going into these 6, I would also like to point out one which is very important, but which is not in the list because, yeah, it's something which cannot be really like it will not be pointed out by automatic tools. And I have to mention that the list we just saw before is based on automatic tooling. So yeah, this is why I want to point out interactive elements must be focusable. And because I guess that this will also be one of the most common WCAG failures, but it's not in the list. So yeah, but yeah, what it is actually, what does sorry, what does it mean? Like interactive elements must be focusable. So yeah, it means that links, form fields, widgets, buttons, and menu items should all be focusable. So like all the interactive elements, which, for example, when you navigate a web page with your keyboard, also a mouse, but you want to have this like kind of focus indicator that shows you that yeah, you are now on this specific interactive element, and you can now interact with the web content. So this is very important, so that the content can be operated through a keyboard or a keyboard interface. So yeah, so an alternative keyboard can be used. Yeah, which is very important to make your yeah, website operable yeah, by people with no vision, for example, who cannot use devices that require eye-hand coordination, for example, like a mouse. And yeah, it's also, I have to mention that most preferably, you should always use naturally focusable HTML elements, so native HTML elements, which already come with this functionality built in. Let's say, for example, a button, for example, is a native HTML element, which will have it already, yeah, built in. But for example, if you use a div as a button, you won't have it. So for example, yeah, how can you fix it when you have this kind of issues? So yeah, to make unfocusable elements accessible, you have to put them in the natural focus order. So you have to use a tab index 0 to put them in this natural focus order of a browser. And also, for example, you have to make sure that you have stylings for focus indicators. So it's very important not to hide them. Yeah, it's very important that users can basically see this kind of focus indicators on a web page. And yeah, now, as you can see on the left screenshot here, we don't have any focus indicators. And on the right side, you can see what would happen when I would tap through a page. So I would always get, okay, I can see now where I am. Now I could, for example, open the burger menu with my keyboard. I could now, yeah, navigate to Google Identity Services or whatever like this link is about. I could open the search. So this is what we basically mean by interactive elements must be focusable. Okay, and now to the first one from the list. So yeah, we have low contrast text, and as you can see here, success criteria is contrast, and it means that there's a very low contrast between text and the background color, as you can also see here in this example. For example, where we have this very light gray on this darker gray, which is not accessible. But on the other side, we have, for example, a white text on this gray background, which is accessible at level AA. So what can you do to kind of fix these kind of issues? So there's a lot of tools which you can also use, for example, contrast checker, which will basically also point out if the color is having if a contrast is big enough between the text and the background, but also if the size is enough. Because, for example, we can see here that AA level, we have to ensure that the contrast ratio is at least at 4.5 to 1 for small text and 3 to 1 for large text. And so, this is very important. But normally these kind of tools which I just mentioned, the contrast checkers, for example, will tell you which kind of ratio you have and if it's enough to be compliant. And the next one is missing alternative text for images. So the point is when you are missing alt text for images on a web page, the information which are visible, but for someone who has visual impairments, he won't get this kind of information because the screen reader will not read out what is there. So if you don't have alt text at all, the screen reader will just read image, and the screen reader will not read out to the visual impaired user what is basically being shown in this screenshot or in this image. And here on the right side, for example, we have this example of this image with brown grass, which is also, so it's not just about providing alt text, but it's also about providing proper alt text. So it's also very important to kind of describe the context of this content. So for example, okay, this is brown grass swaying in the breeze, and or let's say, for example, how we can see it here on the next slide, and this example from a Central Park. So it's not. You would always like to describe what it is, maybe like more in depth. For example, okay, this is an aerial view of Central Park in New York, and not just say, okay, this is a park. So this is also very important, not just providing alt text, but also providing all the kind of information which might be important. Let's say, for example, you have a web shop, or like you are selling clothes, and you have this jacket. So it's very important to describe this jacket to the user. For example, to say, okay, what is the color? How is it shaped? Like, what does the buttons look like? So basically that all this kind of information which are visible in the image should also be kind of stated in alt text then. And for empty links, it's also about describing the purpose, so the context of these links. And so let's say, for example, as we can see also in this example here, we have this basket, and it's just a link, and we have this icon. So a screen reader will just read out as a link, and to a user, for example, to a visual impaired user, it will be hard to know, like, okay, what is this link about? Like, what is the purpose of this link? And to kind of really express the intent, we can do it like as it's visible here on the right side. So we can also, like, for example, we could use a span and say, okay, this is a basket icon. So, okay, this is the link to the basket. And so it's, yeah, very important to provide text revealing a link, especially if you're using icons, so that it kind of describes the functionality or the purpose of that link. And also some additional guidance when it comes to providing links. So yeah, you have to ensure that the link text is clear. And so yeah, don't just say read more. Because, for example, if you are using a web page with a screen reader and you're navigating through it, and you will like you will hear like some content being read out, and then you see like, oh, read more. It's always better to say what the link is about. So for example, we also have here some helpful resources, because there was, for example, an accessibility lawsuit against Kraft Heinz, which was exactly on this topic. So just don't say learn more or read more, say what this link is about. So for example, we have this here, like read the blog, more camping hacks, find camping and hiking classes. So all this kind of information, which will be a big help for visually impaired users, for example, because they will just get it read out by the screen reader, and we can just navigate directly to this page. Yeah, and now for missing form input labels, which is also very close to what I mentioned about the links. So yeah, it's very important to kind of have this kind of information. Okay, what is this input about, and what is it's also about kind of describing this relationship between an input and a label, which you can also see here on the right side. So for example, it's not enough to say, okay, label, email address, and then say like, okay, just put an input right after it. It's not enough, because you kind of have to make it visible to the browser that this specific label is associated with this input field. So you have to use this for attribute and put the ID there. So it's associated with this input. And so the browser knows, okay, this is the label, and can read it out to the user in the end. So this is also very important when it comes to forms. So that people can like really navigate through formulas and fill them out. And for empty buttons, this is also like very close what I described with links. So an empty button is a button basically which has no text. For example, as we can also see here is this example with the search icon. So yeah, we have an SVG, this is just an image and a button, but we don't have any text stating what the kind of the role of this button is. And so it's very important to have this descriptive text presented to the screen reader user, which will kind of indicate the function of this button. And so on the right side we can see how it's done the correct way. For example, okay, when you have a button with an image, just make sure to also maybe use an image and provide the SVG over the source, and also like use an alt text. So it's all clear, okay, I can to open the search input field with this. And also, you also have, for example, you can use like, okay, area described by, if you for example, if you use a div on at the button, you could, for example, add a role and with area and also area described by. But as I mentioned before, it's better to always use native HTML elements, for example, this button better. And one also very important thing is that messing document language, which is actually the last WCAG failure from the list. So what it means is that, yeah, you have to provide the language, which is the kind of the language you're using on this page, or of this portion of this page, because this will allow the screen readers to read the content properly to the user, basically, because yeah, for example, let's say that you're having a page with in English, but you're providing yeah, like FR for France, then for French, then actually the screen reader you will basically load another language package. And so this is very important why you have to basically yeah, add an language to the HTML, so that the browser and also the screen reader in the end knows, okay, like what package to load, and so it can basically read the content out to the yeah, user properly and appropriately. Okay, yeah, and that's actually it for the first webinar. And also, as I mentioned before, I would like to ask you to fill out the feedback form, which will be on the right-hand side of your screen. And yeah, hopefully we will see each other in the next webinar session.